What's going on, guys? It's Tyler from Sideline Signal here with Andrew, as always, as we introduce our second episode of the week. First, we reacted to the playoff rankings the second week of the committee. Now we're going to be going through some quarterback superlatives from this class. Obviously, both of our NFL teams are already mid-tank, but a lot of teams are getting ready for April. And this is kind of an interesting quarterback class with a bunch of different options for that QB1 slot and just in general where they slot through. So we're going to go through who we think is the most pro ready, who's got the highest ceiling, and then who's got the biggest potential for bust. And then we'll also be talking about some resume things from this past week of rankings from the committee. So Andrew, how you doing? And are you ready to get the show started?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Interesting week of football, interesting committee rankings. We're getting closer to the draft, so we're getting closer to starting to evaluate these guys for the NFL. So I'm fired up and I'm ready to go whenever you are.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue. Let's get right into it. So we got a bunch of guys here, and I want to, make sure to make this specific. We are talking about these guys right here. So Cam Ward from Miami, obviously. We got Dylan Gabriel from Oregon. We got Shadur Sanders from Colorado. Quinn Ewers from Texas. Jalen Milrow from Alabama, and Jackson Dart from Ole Miss. We were going to put Garrett Nussmeier from LSU and Carson Beck from Georgia, but we feel that they played themselves out of a first round grade, a first round anything with their kind of play. So we're going to focus in on these six guys here going into it as we look forward to April here. So without further ado, Andrew, who do you think, which of these guys do you think is the most pro ready?
Yeah, I'm going to go with Jalen Milrow from Alabama. And I think he's a really interesting prospect. I think the concern that we've seen so far this season has been his consistency. Obviously, he was highly touted last year in their playoff run that ended in the semifinals. But looking at it this year, a lot of the quarterbacks have flaws. I don't think this is the most pro-ready draft per se compared to some of the previous years. But Jalen Milrow has really been an interesting guy to me. He's been able to do it a lot with his legs. His running is really, really good. Interesting. I see it as a little different than even Jaden Daniels last year. I feel like he's more of a safe runner than Daniels was. Daniels loved to run himself into pressure, but he's smart with the ball in his hands when he's taken off. His passing, probably his deep ball is a little bit of a concern, but I've really liked what he's been able to do both with his legs and with his arms. And honestly, when you look at it, to me, he kind of reminds me a little bit of Lamar Jackson when he was in college. And I think it's really funny to me is that this could potentially be a team with the exact same record that Louisville had the year Lamar won his Heisman. And obviously, statistically speaking, they're different. Lamar had a miraculous season, both passing and running, but they have really similar play styles. And obviously, he didn't get drafted as high as he probably thought. But looking at it, I mean, he gives flashes of that Lamar Jackson era. So I think when looking at it, if a team early on needs a guy who can run and throw, maybe to build a team around in that style, I think Jalen Milrow right now is probably the most pro ready.
That is a very good point. He's a factor with both his arm and his legs there. I'll talk about him later in one of our other categories. But for my most pro ready, I'm going to go with Shadur Sanders out of Colorado, obviously coached by Prime Time. And the reason why I say this is that all these quarterbacks in this class, I feel like he has the best pocket presence. I think that does the best under pressure. That Colorado O-line had been abysmal. They picked it up, but they were abysmal, and he was still putting up numbers. Also, something to point out is that they're running a semi NFL offense. Pat Shermer, a former head coach and obviously OC in the NFL, is his OC at Colorado. So I have a feeling that Shadur is able to break down, play calls, a lot of information, a lot of film work. Say what you want about his personality, and I've had some issues with it in the past, but the man can play, and it's pretty clear that he cares about this, that this is his life. And he really cares. So I feel that Shadur Sanders is the most pro ready because I feel like he can digest information the best. And obviously, the NFL is a bit more of a pocket passers game. Not even really anymore. We're seeing people that run the ball like Josh Allen and Lamar, as you just mentioned, Andrew. But I feel like Shadur would be ready to kind of step in with the least challenge of all these guys. Obviously, he's got a lot to prove, a lot of pressure being who his father is and how much kind of he's talked and hyped himself up. So he's got a lot to prove, but I feel like he is the most ready to go in an NFL offense.
Yeah, that's a great point. Obviously, I thought about taking Shedeur, but I knew we were probably going to have similar ones, so I wanted to give a little bit of variety. But I mean, you talk about that with the pressure of performance based on who his dad is, but I think that also plays into a good factor for him. He has somebody who's been, a Hall of Famer in the NFL, a defensive player, somebody that he can go to for advice. Hey, when they show this kind of pressure off the edge, or when these corners are dropping back into this coverage, what should I look at? How do I navigate the media if they don't favor me? All these kind of things that Prime was so good at. It's something that people talk about a lot with Arch Manning. You have a great support system around you with great Hall of Fame quarterbacks in your family. And it's the same with Shedeur Sanders, obviously just in a different style, obviously Dion being a corner. But I think he, like you said, the pocket presence is probably the best out of the current draft eligible quarterbacks. But I think the ability to have that advice from a Hall of Famer also plays into his favor.
Also, his father being a DB can tell him when he's tipping off, when he's staring at his reads too long, stuff like that. So there's a lot of advantages to having someone be a Hall of Fame player as a father in the NFL, especially as corner when you're a quarterback there. So it'll be interesting to see how he performs and where the stock goes. Obviously, Andrew and I have no idea where these quarterbacks are going in the NFL draft. We'll get a better idea when we find out the draft order and kind of get closer to the combine and stuff like that. But any one of these guys could be taken first overall, second overall, third overall. We really don't know. So we're going to try to figure that out now. But on to the guy with the highest ceiling. So this isn't necessarily ready for the pros. He might have to develop, but the guy that you think out of these six guys will be the best, or has the chance to be the best, I should say, in the right situation. Who are you going to go with?
This is going to be a little surprising, but because of what we talked about off camera, but I might go Dylan Gabriel here from Oregon. Now, I will say right now, I don't think he is anywhere near pro ready compared to some of these quarterbacks in this draft class. He's pro ready, but there's a reason that he took his fifth year and that he's transferred to three schools in his time. He's never been the top guy looked at for these draft classes of past that he was eligible for. But I think the way that he plays under Oregon is very poised. He has that deep ball that he can go to with Evan Stewart or Trayshawn Holden, and he makes really good reads in those short to mid range passing options, and he's able to run it with his feet. So I think for him, he would be a great project quarterback that has a high ceiling. If he can go to a team that is kind of that dual threat, where almost like a Philadelphia under Jalen Hurts, where Hurts can run and he runs if he needs to, but it's that pocket presence that he has. So if he can go to a team like Philadelphia under the right situation, sit a few years, I think that would really benefit him, where he might not be that instant success, but I think over the long term, he might be able to develop into a great quarterback given the right system. So I'm going to go with Dylan Gabriel because when you look at some of these quarterbacks that have come out of previous drafts that have gone high, they've kind of been really concerning when watching the draft. These guys that are just deep ball threats, I'll say a Will Levis and an Anthony Richardson, where those short to mid range passes during the combine were really shaky, but then teams saw them throw 80 yards down the field and fell in love with that. They've been really, really flat in the NFL. They've struggled a lot. But you have a guy who's consistent anywhere from a check down to 10 yards on a slant or a post. He's going to hit that every single time. He can evade the pressure, and the deep ball might not be as strong as some other candidates in these draft classes, but he can still hit it. So I think give him the time, have him sit for a year or two and develop. I think Dylan Gabriel has the chance to have the highest ceiling.
And it's funny that you said Dylan there because I'm not surprised at all. Honestly, I was going to say pro ready until you kind of talked me out of it. I changed my answer without telling you. But Dylan Gabriel, most accurate, I could say, probably either him or Shedeur. It's got to be awfully close between the two. But just watching someone that's very technical, very precise, that's something that you see in the NFL, and that's what pays off. You see all these guys, like I'm thinking Jared Goff is a guy that I could see. Obviously, Gabriel has better mobile skills. He can move better, probably has a better arm in terms of power. But Jared Goff is someone that can thread the needle. It's not flashy. It's not overtly, like you're not freaking out every time Jared Goff throws the ball, but it's going to be where it should be. Obviously, he threw a lot of interceptions this past week, so it was bad. But before then, I'm pretty sure he had six incompletions over like a 2 week or 3 week span. So it was absolutely ridiculous. But I could see Dylan Gabriel kind of transforming into something like that. So I really like that take. For me, the highest ceiling, you already mentioned him. I'm going to mention him now. Jalen Milroe, for sure. You said Lamar Jackson. I see that 1,000%. I'm going to take you into his stats. You know, his passing stats aren't great. As Andrew said, he's definitely got to get better with accuracy, the deep ball as well. He's got 2,046 passing yards, a 67.4 completion percentage, 13 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and an 85.7 QBR, which is good for fifth in the country, which is pretty good. But the touchdown to interception ratio is not great at almost 2 to 1 there. But then you go to his rushing stats, right? This just blows me away. And I hated that it had to be my team, but he made an example out of us last weekend with 3 touchdowns there. He's got 114 carries, 565 yards, and 16 rushing touchdowns, which is ridiculous. He is just such a threat. And the way that I see him different than Lamar is that he is more of a power runner. He will run you over, whereas Lamar kind of evades you. That is a huge tool. Now, I do worry with Jalen is will he get hurt? Because we see that all the time. Even with a guy like Jaden Daniels that's in the league right now that's doing real well, you kind of compared him to. Um, he is at risk of getting hurt, but even he is a little less like now in the NFL. And in college, he never slid. That was the issue. He always got decked. But now he's kind of taking less chances, and Milroe's going to have to learn that himself. Now, personally, as a Giants fan, I would love to get Milroe at the top of the draft because I do think he could be Lamar. And I would love, and I think that if he goes to a system in a place that they are willing to build the team like the Ravens, build around the O line, build around the running game, make passing kind of secondary. I wouldn't say it's secondary. I mean, the man's won 2 MVPs, Lamar and Lamar. But where it's run heavy, it's joyless murder ball, as they kind of refer to it down in Tuscaloosa. And I'd love to run that, and I'd love to see how that works in the NFL because I bet you would do great. So for that reason, I'm going to go with the highest ceiling in Jalen Milroe.
Yeah, it completely makes sense. Obviously, we both highly value him. And I think it's going to be interesting too to see how his stock goes depending on how the remainder of Alabama's season goes. If they're able to make a run, obviously make it into the playoffs as they're currently slated to. And if they can make a run deeper into the college football playoffs, is his stock going to go higher? Because right now he's kind of a mid first round pick. Obviously, the biggest two are Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. They're the highest touted picks out of the latest mock drafts that we've been seeing. So I'm really curious to see, depending on how the remainder of the season goes, where he kind of falls in with the current mock drafts.
Yeah, I would say that he's pretty much the wild card. With the rest of them, even Dart and Ewers, you have an idea that they'll be near the top of the draft. There's not much fluctuation, I would say. It really determines like which team wants which guy throughout the combine and the draft interviews and stuff like that. But Milroe, it's very static. Like it could go either way. It's bouncing all over the place as draft stock. He could be the first quarterback. He could be the last quarterback taken. So that's kind of the intrigue there. So we went with our two positives, two guys that we think are going to succeed. Now we go on to our negative here, the biggest potential for bust. Now I want to pump the brakes here. We're not saying that this guy is going to be a bust. We're saying that we could see him struggle from what he's put out this year and over his career in the NFL. Obviously, we'll be calling out who we think are busts about 2, 3 months from now when we get closer to the draft. But Andrew, who do you think has the biggest potential for bust in this draft class?
I'm going to go with Cam Ward out of Miami. And I know this is going to be shocking because right now he's projected to be the second quarterback taken and potentially just the second overall pick in the draft. But I think there's a few things that I'm concerned about with his game. Obviously, right now, he's obviously in the older kind of echelon. He's born in 2002, so he's 22. He's going to be 23 come the NFL season. Obviously, it might not be a concern. We've seen guys like Bo Nix right now, who's doing really well as a rookie. The reason I say that is because you lose extra years of development because he's already older, which is a big concern. You don't have really the opportunity to sit him because you kind of have to hope that he's already ready to go. And yes, right now he leads the nation in passing yards. I think he's currently first in the nation in passing yards at 3,500 passing yards. But the way I see it is I don't think that his game really translates as well. He plays really nonchalant. That's something that the media has highlighted a lot. You see all these kind of casual step outs out of bounds and all that. That's not going to fly in the NFL. You have grown men compared to the college athletes you're going against that are going to try to kill you in the pocket. And I think that's something he really has to get out of his system. Obviously, it's different, but that's something that you can't really outcoach. You have to kind of get rid of that habit. And I think that's going to be something he struggles with. And also game management down the stretch. If they're in a tight game, which they've been in so many times this season, what has been the one key factor that Cam Ward has had every game that has bailed him out? It's the deep ball to Xavier Restrepo. And if he's going into a team that doesn't have an Xavier Restrepo like guy who's bursting pace that can get you an instant 70-yard play with a go route or a deep post, he's going to struggle if it's a close game. He's going to be forced to make reads that he doesn't usually do. He's going to try to force the ball because he has to. And because of that, I'm not as confident that in those, difficult positions in the NFL that he's going to have that instant success. So it's just a little bit of he's not honestly, I wouldn't even say he's that pro ready. I think a lot of people are overhyping him. And I think what he's doing in the college season is phenomenal. Miami, obviously, they're in the playoff. He's having a Heisman level season, but I don't think it necessarily translates. There's a lot of things outside of just his ability to throw the ball that kind of concern me transitioning to the NFL. So while I think he still has a lot of upside and a lot of potential to be a great NFL quarterback, he's the guy right now that I'm probably the most concerned with transitioning.
Yeah, and just a little thing before I go into my answer. Cam Ward kind of reminds me of Aroldis Chapman in the MLB, where he's high leverage. He's got one of the best arms in MLB history. He can throw 105, but you don't know if he's going to throw balls or strikes. And in the NFL, you got to make a window even smaller than this, honestly, even smaller than two hands. Can he do that consistently? Because it's not often, unless you're playing the Giants, that the coverage is going to leave wide receivers 30 yards wide open. So he's going to be able to fit the ball in tight spaces, which obviously he's got the arm to do it, but can he kind of fine tune that accuracy and not so much just toss it out there and kind of place it and get some finesse to his game because he's definitely got the power. In terms of my guy for the biggest potential for bust in the NFL, I really didn't want to say this guy because I wanted him for my team. I'll take any of these guys just about. But I'm gonna go with Quinn Ewers out of Texas, and I know, he was like, yeah, I've been up on him all year, but it was really telling against Georgia that he does not do well when there is pressure. The blitz has gotten the better of him. We take a look at that stat line when they played Georgia. He was 25 for 43 through 211 yards, two touchdowns, one pick. Yeah, you look at that, you go, that's not too bad. But if you watch the game, it looked like he was struggling out there just from the get-go. They kind of took the pedal off the gas, I would say Georgia did. So they were able to kind of catch up and he was able to get his stats up. But it was really ugly for most of that game. And that worries me. Now, I will say another game where they blitzed a lot. Wink Martindale, who's now the defensive coordinator at Michigan, he loves the blitz. They pressured Ewers a bunch and it didn't phase him and he balled out and they won that game 31-12. But I haven't seen enough of Quinn in these high leverage, high pressure games. We'll talk about Texas's resume in a minute, but besides Georgia, they have not played a good defense. Straight up. They just haven't played a good defense, and he hasn't looked that impressive. Like, if he had Cam Ward's numbers to this point, and obviously he got hurt, so I understand that. We're looking at a guy that's got 19 touchdowns, and of these guys, the only one that has less is Jalen Milrow. But Jalen Milrow has 16 rushing touchdowns. Excuse me. For Ewers, um, the issue is going to be can he withstand that pressure? Can he take a deep breath? Can he stay in the pocket even when it's collapsing around him? And then can he get more production? Because what I've seen from him, it's not great. I mean, he's got a 71.5 QBR as well, which is good for 36th in the country, while the rest of these guys are in the top 20, all of them. So it'll be interesting to see, but I feel like we're not talking about this enough that Quinn Ewers could possibly struggle.
Yeah, and it's something that was kind of spoken about before the season started. Obviously, he was kind of, will he stay? Will he go to the draft before the season started? Obviously, he stayed, but it was his sample size was small. as a starting quarterback, and that's why he didn't go because I think it's 15 to 20 is kind of the amount of games that NFL execs and scouts want to see out of a player to fully be able to judge him, especially at quarterback. And he wasn't there yet, obviously. And so he came back, but we still get a small sample size because he was injured this season. And that's going to be a concern. Will he be able to stay healthy down the next few years of the early parts of his season where he can make a name for himself? So I think that's a concern. But yeah, the amount of pressure that he's constantly under, and when he's under pressure, he does not perform well, which, as an NFL quarterback, you have to be able to do that. One thing, Drake May was a guy last year. He was constantly under pressure, but the execs and the scouts loved him because he was so good under pressure. He was able to feel the pocket moving. He was able to escape pressure, and he was able to succeed when he was under pressure. Right now, I don't think Ewers does that. Again, I think he has a lot of potential to be really good, but I agree with you. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how he kind of transitions.
Yeah, and they'll have plenty of games to prove it. If they are to make the SEC title game, they're going to have to play a game at Texas A&M, who's got a great D line and a possible playoff run. So he's going to face those kind of situations again, and we'll see how he kind of handles that. So we go from talking about Quinn Ewers, as I mentioned, to kind of talking about their teams as we get into some of these resume discrepancies from this past week. Andrew and I got a lot to talk about this. We kind of reflected on in the first episode. Those were our live reactions. Now we're 2 days, 3 days out from the rankings, and we got some thoughts, guys. So first, I want to talk to you about the number 3 ranked Texas Longhorns. I'm going to go over the resume, Andrew, if you don't mind, before we kind of get into it here. So this is the record of each team that Texas has played this year and beaten, right? So they played Colorado State 6-3 in the Mountain West, which is eh. 5-5 Michigan. Obviously, that was a road game. It was a hostile environment, but Michigan's 5-5 and very mid in that Big Ten. A 4-5 UTSA team out of the American, very mid and low tier. A 5-4 UL Monroe team out of the Sun Belt, the Sun Belt, not a great. A 2-8 Mississippi State squad that actually hung in the game for about I want to say 3.5 quarters, maybe the fourth quarter Texas pulls away. But Mississippi State, terrible this year, down year. The Cotton Bowl against a 5-5 Oklahoma squad that is obviously in a down year as well, moving into the SEC. They barely beat Vanderbilt, who's probably the best team that they've played that isn't named Georgia. At 6-4, they barely beat them. That was probably their best win, and then they got the win this past weekend over Florida, who is 4-5 at home. So, Andrew, looking at Texas, looking at what I just read, what the resume is, obviously they lost to Georgia, but it seems like Georgia's the only good team that they've played to this point. So, what do you think? There are teams like SMU that have a loss to BYU and have beaten ranked teams. There's even teams that are outside the top 12 that have better resumes objectively than Texas. So, what are your thoughts on them being the third rank?
Yeah, it's kind of disgraceful, I'll be honest. I think this is something that I almost made a video on this week and then ended up holding off because I figured we'd talk about it on the podcast. And we'll get into it a little bit more with Penn State too. I think this is really the committee is just giving them the benefit of the doubt because of their name, because it's UT, because they have Quinn Ewers. It's the entertainment value. They like the names on the team and they like the team, so they don't care. They don't care that they lost to Georgia and look terrible. They don't care that their best win is Vanderbilt. They don't. They're going to keep them high. And this is one thing that really frustrated me with the committee for the first 2 weeks is they're afraid to shake things up. Texas, outside of their name and who they are on paper, are nowhere near one of the best resumes in the game. I believe that they're a top 12 team, and I think it's partially difficult because of how the SEC, a predominance of them are 2-loss or worse. So it's kind of we have to have a 1-loss SEC team high. We just have to. And so I think this is a staple of the fact that if you took Texas's name out and put any other team that isn't a big name out of the SEC or the Big Ten, this team's nowhere near the playoffs. And it's really frustrating. Like I'll use SMU as an example. If this SMU team right now had that resume, they're not in the playoffs. They're probably 20. Even if I'll say Indiana, if that's Indiana's schedule and they got lost to Georgia or let's say Ohio State, just to kind of make it more realistic because they wouldn't probably schedule Georgia, but they looked awful in it. They're nowhere near the playoffs. But the fact that it's the big name brand of Texas football, hook 'em horns, they're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's the thing is that's frustrating that I think a lot of people forget sometimes is a lot of these bigger schools will get the benefit of the doubt and get put in because of boosters. How many people are going to go to the game? The amount of viewers are going to get drawn in. So when building out this committee rankings and building out the playoffs, they shouldn't factor in the entertainment side of it, but they will because ultimately it always comes down to money. And when you have a team like Texas who's going to bring in a lot of fans, they're going to sell a lot of merchandise at these events in the playoffs. You're going to get sold out crowds if they have a home game, if they're not in the first round bye. They're going to bring in revenue for the NCAA and for ESPN and all that. So they're going to try their best to put them in and put them as high as possible to get fans to go. It's the same reason why, people are saying don't count out a three-loss SEC school to get into the playoffs because they know that the SEC will bring fans and bring money in. And it's really frustrating. And this is honestly the same point that I have with Penn State. It's the same with the Big Ten. They're going to bring in money, so they're willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I'll wait a little bit and get more into detail with Penn State once we get to it. But yeah, it's frustrating because right now, I think Texas is probably 8, give or take, based on resume. I would say Tennessee's a better resume than Texas has. They have a better quality win. And yes, I guess that's when you go into the factor of is the loss to Arkansas worse than not having a great win. That's what the committee figures, I guess. But the fact they beat Alabama, who's a playoff team right now. I think Tennessee should be higher than them. I don't think Texas is the best SEC school, and I don't think they're the third ranked team in the country. I think a lot of these teams could beat them. And that's the thing is people always say the on paper, like they haven't lost to anybody, but they easily could. So I disagree with it. I think Texas should be lower in around the tens range.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit before we hopped on, and I agree 100%. You talked about kind of having Tennessee above. I would argue even Notre Dame has a better resume than Texas, and they have that loss to NIU. Obviously, that's going to hold them back. They probably won't crack the top seven, um, but they got a better win. They've got better wins. BYU, better wins. They beat SMU. Texas has not beaten a ranked team, and yeah, Vanderbilt was ranked when they beat them. They were 24th in the country, but I'm not counting that. That's kind of ridiculous, and I agree 100%. And I think we saw it early in the year when Michigan got out to that 2-2 or 3-3 start or whatever it was, and they were still ranked, and no one else had two or three losses at that time that were still in the top 25. So it's pretty obvious that they want the biggest brands to be in there for revenue purposes, and it is disappointing, certainly because it could cost the team. Like you put in a let's just say Texas loses to Texas A&M, doesn't make the SEC title game or whatever, and they get slotted in because they're Texas, and then you knock a one-loss Indiana or like a one-loss BYU or something like that. Knock them out. That's ridiculous. Both of those teams deserve a fighting chance. So I don't like the metric that they used, and it just doesn't work for me because they weren't even impressive in many of these games, besides the ones that were obviously lower tier where the spread was already like 32. But like I look at that Mississippi State game, they didn't pull away until the very end. Mississippi State was the better team for like half of that game, which is inexcusable. Obviously, they're doing a full rebuild. RIP Mike Leach, obviously, always try to remember him, one of the great characters, but they're still backpedaling off of that and trying to rebuild this program into an SEC school again. And they were able to play with Texas for most of that game. So, overtly disappointed in them, and they should be back. I agree with you, either like 10, 9, or 8, somewhere in there. I mean, if you're going to move Miami back to their spot, which I also don't agree with simply because I thought they should have been out, then Texas should be back there as well. So, any thoughts before we move on to Penn State, or did you already get your spiel out?
I think I've said my piece, but yeah, it's frustrating because there's certain teams, like I said, they just look at the roster and the name of the team, and they're going to be ranked high. They're too afraid to drop a team who's good on paper lower. And I think another loss for Texas should humble the committee and drop them lower, but who knows, man.
Who knows? And it is going to be a jumble of two-loss SEC teams. It kind of seems to this point, unless Texas uh, silences the haters and wins the SEC title with one loss. But moving on to the Big Ten here, as Andrew talked about, touched on it, Penn State. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to roll through the records of their wins and then give you their loss and then let you guys kind of sort it out as we give our thoughts on it. So for Penn State, their wins here. 5-4 West Virginia on the road. A scare against a 5-4 MAC team in Bowling Green. I don't know if you guys remember that since it was so early in the year, but Bowling Green had the lead, and it was super close all the way down to the wire. Penn State ends up eking out a win. They beat 0-9 Kent State. That's basically like playing a Division II school. No offense, Kent State. They beat 6-3 Illinois, so that's their best win. As of right now, that was a good win, but even Illinois wasn't as great as they were at the beginning of the season and is kind of middle of the pack at this point in the Big Ten. They beat 4-5 UCLA. Not a good team. We've seen that very mid. 4-5 USC they've beaten in overtime. That was a crazy game, but USC's got 5 losses, so that win does not look great. It actually hurts them, I think, in a lot of cases. They beat a 5-4 Wisconsin. That was a big win at Camp Randall. They did a pretty good job there, even when Aller went down. And then they also beat 5-5 Washington this past weekend. So, a lot of teams besides Kent State, honestly, they're all hovering around 500 here. And then obviously they lost by 7 at home to Ohio State, which is their only loss. But Andrew, I mean, rather than kind of because I'm assuming you already disagree with it, like listening to that resume and then listening to Texas's, which one do you think is better? Do you
I'll
have
be
any?
honest, it's Texas. I think it's Texas because we've seen Illinois is nowhere near as favored as I'll say a team like Vanderbilt, and even honestly, probably a team like Oklahoma. And so I think when you compare their resumes, I will say it's hard because you look at the losses. I would take the loss that Penn State had as a better loss to Ohio State than obviously Texas to Georgia because Penn State was in that game the entire time. They just couldn't get over the hump. Two bad interceptions kind of cost them. They were playing well defensively. They started off, 10-0 field goal and then the pick six early on. So Penn State was in that game. Like I said, I would take Texas. Penn State, I disagree because it's nothing to do with the teams and their performances rather than my gripes with the committee. Because this is the thing, and a lot of people on social media I saw talk about it, and it's kind of funny. It's like, well, who cares about the regular season then? Because it just seems like we're picking just the best 12 teams. It doesn't seem like the resume matters. And especially for these top teams, it doesn't. They're going to get in because of their name. And so, like, why is in these committee ranking shows and when they're talking to the head of the committee, why do they always reference the resume? Because it doesn't seem to matter at all. And it's the same thing. Indiana was disrespected. They're undefeated right now. Uh, they were low until this week, and obviously they have a terrible strength of schedule. Nothing to knock Indiana. They deserve to be a playoff team based on their performances. But even like last year, Georgia was ranked number 2 in the country, 10-0, and they had the 103rd strength of schedule. So, is it really their resume is that impressive, or it's just we think Georgia is going to be the best on paper and be the most competitive team, so no matter what, they're going to get in? It's frustrating, and I think it inversely negatively impacts Indiana because they're not that staple program. If they lose a game, there's a small chance that they get knocked out. Now, Ohio State could lose 2 games. If they lose another, let's say Indiana beats them, Ohio State will probably stay in. But if Indiana was 2 loss right now, they're nowhere near it. And so it's really frustrating to see that they lean on the side of just the power of the conference. They give conferences benefits of the doubt, the SEC and the Big Ten especially. I mean, hell, I would argue right now, if Oregon were to cough up a game in the regular season and then lose in the Big Ten title game, they would still get in as a 2 loss. I don't think Indiana or some of these smaller schools, like in SMU right now is on the outside looking in as a 1 loss. They lose another, they're done. They don't have any benefit of the doubt, but some of these bigger teams that have way worse resumes, Miami might still sneak in as a 2 loss over SMU, which is ridiculous to me because SMU have a better resume. They probably would, I would say they have similar big wins to Miami, But if you look at it consistently, the only game that I guess you can compare that would be bad was the OT win over Duke, where it was a 3-point win and Miami blew out Duke. But at the same time, you look at the quality of losses. You lose by 3 early in the season at home to BYU, who's currently undefeated and sixth in the country. That's your quality loss. Miami's is Georgia Tech, and they did not look that great against Georgia Tech. They got shut down offensively. But you mean to tell me that SMU's resume isn't better than Miami's? SMU is atop of the ACC. They are undefeated in the ACC, and they're on the outside looking in as a one loss. If they lose another, there's no shot of them. And so that's the thing that's frustrating. And yes, obviously, you're going to give the benefit of the doubt to some teams. Some teams, no matter what their record are, they're going to be the best team. I understand that. I don't agree with it necessarily because then what's the point of the resume? And this was my biggest gripe last year. I was a big Florida State in guy. It's the teams that deserve it, not the teams that are the best. And that is the entire reason that they use the resume. But they don't use the resume. They just say, we think these are the best 12 teams. It shouldn't be that. It's who deserves it. And it's really frustrating. I could rant about this for 3 hours. I don't want to make this long for our fans, but yeah, I don't think Penn State or Texas should be as high, especially Penn State too, because they really, really don't have a quality win. And it's like Miami, they've scraped by in so many games against 500 teams. I don't know if you remember, they were losing to UCLA for a little bit in that game too. And these teams are not good. They're nowhere near competitive. They'll be lucky to get a bowl game. And they're scraping by, but they're the fourth best team in the country. I don't think so. I don't even think there's a resume point that can have any rationale outside of their team is good. They like Drew Howard, they like Tyler Warren, and they like the Penn State defense. But outside of that, if you look at how they've performed, you don't say this is the fourth best team in the country. I would argue all of these two-loss SEC teams are better than Penn State. I think all of them could give them a run and beat them. I think Ole Miss right now would go to Happy Valley and beat them in this playoff
Wow.
matchup. And so I don't understand. It really makes me mad, and I do not understand the rationale with the committee. They need to have some balls, and they need to drop these teams that don't have a good resume. You can't just put a team high in the rankings because of who they are. Look at Oregon. Oregon deserved number one. They beat Boise State by 3 at home, which was a tough game, but Boise State, who's the Group of Five champion, and then they beat Ohio State at home. And you have the rationale there. That's probably the two biggest wins of the season for any team. Maybe, Ohio State beating Penn State. Yeah, fair. But if you look at a team, those are the team with the most quality wins. No other team has quality wins like that, especially Penn State. How can you say they're the third best team or the fourth best team and then Texas with the third best team when your wins are against a 6-4 team? It doesn't make sense. That's not a quality win. Obviously, Ohio State's at the 2. They lost by 1 on the road at Autzen, and then they beat Penn State. They deserve it. But it's just mind-boggling. I'd put BYU over Penn State. I really would. It is so frustrating. Yeah, I
That's
don't know. Like I said, I'm gonna stop my tangent because I'll go on for like another hour. I'll let you have the floor now. What are you thinking?
that was a lot, but I agree with most of it. And you were kind of speaking my thoughts here. And I wanted to touch on, you talked about like scheduling. Like it doesn't matter who you schedule as long as you got the brand. I look at a team like SMU, right? We look at their one loss. It was to BYU, right? Week one, I guess, or I don't know if it was week
I think it
two.
was week 2.
Week two. Okay, that was out of conference. Or no, it wasn't out of conference. Well, yeah, it was.
Yeah, it
Sorry,
was.
SMU
Yeah.
was in the ACC. They did not need to schedule that game. So you're telling me if they didn't schedule that game, had this resume, we're undefeated, we're first in the ACC, they'd probably be the fourth team in the country right now. By that rationale, by the rationale they're using for Penn State and Texas, obviously SMU isn't the same brand, unless you want to talk like the Eric Dickerson days where they were running it up and cheating with the recruits and ended up getting the death penalty. But like this is ridiculous. You're hanging this team out to dry. This is the best year they've had since those years already, and we're gonna punish them because it's Southern Methodist and not Texas. Like that's silly. It's really silly. BYU as well. Like I agree with you 100%. BYU should be above Penn State, and I think they should be above Texas too. I'm looking at their schedule right now. Yeah, there's been some close wins, excuse me. But they beat SMU on the road, who's the 14th team in the country. They crushed Kansas State, who's 20th in the country, right? They beat a team in Arizona who was supposed to be better, didn't end up. And then there's some close games here, but they have a better resume. It's not like you guys said, like you just said, it's not the best. It's who deserves it. And if we're gonna sit here and be like, oh, the resumes and the way I think of it is that the committee's in there like with their monocles on, looking at the resume on a sheet of paper, like you would in a job interview or something like that. It's not. It's probably they're all fangirling over these big oh, Texas, oh, the boosters, the NIL money. Let's make more for Texas. And I bet you it's biased, and I really do. And Andrew texted me this, and we talked about it a little bit. But if you have an active position at a school, you should probably not be in the CFP committee. Because if your team, that your school has a chance of making it, who are you going to bias towards? You can't pretend that we're not going to sit here and pretend like even if I like yeah, it's something that I hope to learn, but hopefully when I'm calling games in the future, if it were a Giants game, I wouldn't be biased towards the Giants, but I'm telling you right now, if you put me in that booth on Sunday, I'm going to be biased towards the Giants. Same way these guys are. I promise you. It's that kind of pride, and I don't blame them. It's a human thing, but you got to be able to take yourself out of that when it's something this important that changes so many things in terms of a season. So yeah, I hate that. I hate that. We talk about strength of losses all the time, and yeah, Texas and Penn State have good losses, I guess. But like you said, I'd argue some two-loss SEC teams have better losses. A team like Alabama. I know they lost to Vanderbilt, but I really think that their resume is better than Texas's and it's better than Penn State's as well right now. And if we're going to justify putting him this high, then why isn't Alabama five? Like it's the same logic. They're using half logic. They're like, oh, the brand's here. It almost feels like they just want BYU and SMU to kind of take care of themselves and get knocked out so that they don't have to put them there. I don't know. That's just my takeaways from it.
Yeah, and the thing for me is it shows that they don't believe in the smaller schools' ability to compete. And I'll give you one. Vanderbilt beat Alabama. Did anybody think Vandy was beating Bama this year? Nobody. Nobody. Vandy hadn't won a game against a number one opponent ever. We see these upsets all the time. I still go back to 2 years ago in bowl games. Did anyone think Tulane was going to beat USC? No,
No.
but they did. You can't just assume the result of a matchup because you think you know college football. Nobody knows until the teams play. And yes, you can say, okay, a team like SMU might get blown out by a team like Texas. Fair, but you can't assume until the game is over. And that's what frustrates me is they just look at it and go, oh, this team, they don't have it. They can't compete with these teams. But they clearly have proven that they can. If you win your conference, if you're competing to win your conference, you're good enough to beat. They're in the Power Four for a reason. It's not like we're sitting here saying an 8-1 team in the American Athletic or an 8-1 team in the Sun Belt deserves to be in over Texas or Alabama. No, it's a team in the Power Four. And yes, I know ACC is looked at as probably the lowest, if not the second lowest of the Power Fours. But if it makes me so mad. If you are a one-loss team with better quality wins than half the teams in the top 12, and your loss is to an undefeated team who's number 6 in the country, how are you not in the playoffs? It doesn't make sense to me. It's really frustrating. Honestly, I think SMU have a better resume than Penn State. But yet here we are. And like I said, I get it. Happy Valley, one of the best stadiums. It's a great historic team. But really, can you make a case for Penn State? What has James Franklin done in his career for him to get this, this
Yeah, the
like
respect.
yes, the prestige that they're just gonna say, okay, yeah, you're number 3, even though your resume is horrible. It makes no sense to me. And I'm curious, I wonder if ESPN would release a rankings based on purely resume, how the rankings would look. Because I guarantee it would be way different than this. And this is why I've seen a lot of people trying to call back and bring the BCS back with the expanded playoffs, which inherently had a lot of flaws. But it's like, I get it. You get the human error with the committee, but it makes no sense. It really doesn't.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to touch on that I just randomly thought of, you think of a team with a pretty bad resume, right? Number 8, Notre Dame. Pretty bad resume, right? They haven't played many teams. They lost NIU at home, but they took care of business. Now, here's the difference between Notre Dame and like the respect that a team like Penn State or Miami's now ranked behind them. But Notre Dame, right? They've only played one ranked team. They beat Texas A&M at Kyle Field, which is a great win, one of the best wins. But you play a team like Purdue, right? You beat them 66-7, the way that you should. Miami of Ohio, 28-3. Take care of business. They beat Louisville by 7. Stanford, they beat 49-7. Georgia Tech, the team that just beat Miami, just beat them. They beat them 31-13 on the road. So same situation as Miami. Navy, a team that was ranked, a team that was getting respect, 51-14 at a neutral site. And then Florida State, obviously horrible, and they treated them like they were horrible, beat them 52-3 at home. And obviously they got some games left. They still got to play Virginia, Army, and USC, but why aren't they ranked higher? Like
I agree.
if we're gonna make that case, why aren't they in the top five?
I agree, and I'm really obviously we'll never know because it happened, but I'm curious to see where Notre Dame would be in the rankings had they beaten NIU. Like, would they be number three? The way that the rationale of the committee has, you could say yes. And obviously, they'll probably rise more if they beat Army. Obviously, the committee doesn't respect Army, but if they win Army, that's another top 25 matchup, and hopefully Army would end up staying in the top 25. But yeah, I mean, they have a better resume than half of them with arguably the worst loss.
Yeah.
It's so annoying. The committee makes me so mad sometimes. And I think I was happier with the rankings the night of, but now that I've kind of slept on it, I am so frustrated with it.
Yeah, and all we can kind of hope is that the marbles fall and the balls bounce the right way, and we kind of get this corrected next week. Obviously, we'll have our live reaction to it,
Yeah.
but this is there's some systemic issues with the committee right now. Like, I'm looking at the rankings on the website right now. So obviously, like you said, Oregon, Ohio State deserve it, but then we got three teams with good losses, two of them with horrible resumes. And then we got two undefeated teams with better resumes than the horrible resumes without a loss, and they're behind them. And then you got a one-loss team with a way better resume at in Tennessee at 7, with 3 and 4 with the worst resume, but better losses. So
It's a wild world we live in. I don't know if we'll ever get a right answer, but
never
I'll
get
be I'll
answers.
be curious to see if teams will start to push for another expansion of the playoffs, try to get it to 16. Because like I said, I think it's going to be inexcusable if SMU don't sneak in as long as they continue to win if they don't sneak into the playoffs. Obviously, they'll get in as an auto if they win the ACC. And if they lose the ACC, then it's we can honestly say they're not going to make it just the way the committee is looking at them. But SMU, I don't even really care that much about SMU, but I'm going to bat for them to defense because I don't care who it is. It could be, it could have been James Madison. It could be any team with that resume. I would want them to get the respect. If it was Boston College, if it was UVA, if it was Maryland, I'd make a case for them. And it's really frustrating to see.
Yeah, because that's a program building year. You build your entire program on a year like this.
Exactly.
And the teams in front of them already have those years. And that you can't let that bias shake in, but it's not something to hold against them.
Yeah.
That's our point.
Historical success should not be a factor in the playoffs, but it is. And it's been like that for years. But historical factors and historical prestige of a program should not be considered when you're looking at teams that deserve to make the playoffs.
Yeah, and obviously we'll see. We got a great weekend of college football coming up here, so it's going to be a wild one for sure.
Yeah.
This has been another episode of Sideline Signal. Thank you guys so much for listening. I am Tyler, of course, with Andrew, as always, my co-host. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, thank you very much. You can check us out there as well. And we do post our weekly content on TikTok at Sideline Signal. So remember to like, follow, and comment. We love responding to the comments. And let's get into it. I cannot wait to watch another weekend of football. Thank you guys so much for listening.